Hello and welcome to Noonday Grace. My name is Liz. I'm the pastor of Grace Baptist Church in Chicago, and I am so happy to have you here with us. Today, we explore a story from the book of Genesis, the story of Joseph. Yes, that Joseph, the Joseph of Technicolor Dreamcoat fame. In the story of Joseph, we encounter a father who is not very smart or in tune with how to love his children. We encounter brothers who are jealous and who exact revenge on their younger brother. We encounter a fractured family, but most of all, we follow the story of Joseph, a young man who is hurt over and over again and finds himself in predicaments not always of his own making. And yet, through his faithfulness to who he knows himself to be, and through God's faithfulness, Joseph is able to overcome what he experiences, and not only overcome, but be a blessing to others. It's a fascinating story that sort of covers the range of human experiences, of the ways in which we hurt each other, and the ways in which we forgive each other as well. So I'm excited about that conversation. As you spend time with us today, I hope that you will make use of the chat section here in the live broadcast. Just let us know who you are, where you're watching from. If this is your first time with us at Noonday Grace, we're so happy to have you. And if it's your millionth time worshiping with Grace, if you've been a Gracie for years, we're also happy to have you. But just use that function not only to introduce yourself and to greet your fellow worshipers this morning, but also to interact with the story today and with the conversation today. Maybe something will spark a question in you, or a reflection, or something you don't quite understand, or something you disagree with really, really strongly. I encourage you to put that in the chat box too. You know, during this time of COVID, we aren't able to meet together and interact as often as we would like, but using technology, we can still be with each other in a very real way. So I really encourage you to stretch yourself, stretch your fingers, type in that chat box what you're thinking about today, and I hope that this morning's, or this afternoon rather, time together is a blessing for you. Before we get started, we will hear the hymn, Leaning on the Everlasting Arms.
What a fellowship, what a joy divine, leaning on the everlasting arms. What a blessedness, what a peace is mine, leaning on the everlasting arms. Leaning, safe and secure from all alarms. Leaning on the everlasting arms. Oh, how sweet to walk in this pilgrim way, leaning on the everlasting arms. Oh, how bright the path grows from day to day, leaning on the everlasting arms. Leaning, safe and secure from all alarms. Leaning on the everlasting arms. What have I to dread? What have I to fear? Leaning on the everlasting arms. I have blessed peace with my Lord so near, leaning on the everlasting arms. Leaning, safe and secure
Now Israel, also called Jacob, loved Joseph more than any of his sons, because he was born when Jacob was old. Jacob had made for him a long robe. When his brothers saw that their father loved him more than any of his brothers, they hated him and couldn't even talk nicely to him. Joseph had a dream and told it to his brothers, which made them hate him even more. He said, "Listen to this dream I had. When we were binding stalks of grain in the field, my stalk got up and stood upright, while your stalks gathered around it and bowed down to my stalk." His brothers said to him, "Will you really be our king and rule over us?" So they hated him even more because of the dreams he told them. Now Joseph went after his brothers and found them in Dothan. They saw Joseph in the distance before he got close to them, and they plotted to kill him. The brothers said to each other, "Here comes that big dreamer. Come on now, let's kill him and throw him into one of the cisterns, and we'll say a wild animal devoured him. Then we will see what becomes of his dreams." When Reuben heard what they said, he saved him from them, telling them, "Let's not take his life." Reuben said to them, "Don't spill his blood. Throw him into this desert cistern, but don't lay a hand on him." He intended to save Joseph from them and take him back to his father. But Judah said to his brothers, "What do we gain if we kill our brother and hide his blood? Come on, let's sell him to the Ishmaelites. Let's not harm him because he's our brother. He's family." His brothers agreed. When some Midianite traders passed by, they pulled Joseph up out of the cistern. They sold him to the Ishmaelites for 20 pieces of silver, and they brought Joseph to Egypt. When Reuben returned to the cistern and found that Joseph wasn't in it, he tore his clothes. Then he returned to his brothers and said, "The boy's gone, and where can I go now?" His brothers took Joseph's robe, slaughtered a male goat, and dipped the robe in the blood. They took the long robe, brought it to their father, and said, "We found this. See if it's your son's robe or not." Jacob recognized it and said, "It's my son's robe. A wild animal has devoured him. Joseph must have been torn to pieces." Then Jacob tore his clothes, put a simple mourning cloth around his waist, and mourned for his son for many days. So meanwhile, Joseph found himself in prison in Egypt, but God was still faithful to him. Eventually, Joseph's ability to interpret dreams caught the eye of the Pharaoh, who elevated Joseph to a high position. When famine ravaged the land, Joseph's shrewdness and planning saved the Egyptians, and it also saved his family, who had to travel to Egypt to find food. And now we pick up the end of the story at the end of Genesis. When Joseph's brothers realized that their father, Jacob, was dead, they said, "What if Joseph bears a grudge against us and wants to pay us back seriously for all of the terrible things we did to him?" So they approached Joseph and said, "Your father gave orders before he died, telling us, 'This is what you should say to Joseph. Please forgive your brother's sins and misdeeds, for they did terrible things to you. Now please forgive the sins of the servants of your father's God.'" Joseph wept when they spoke to him. His brothers wept too, fell down in front of him and said, "We're here as your slaves." But Joseph said to them, "Don't be afraid. Am I God? You planned something bad for me, but God produced something good from it in order to save the lives of many people, just as he's doing today. Now don't be afraid. I will take care of you and your children."
I'm here with Angela Goodson. Angela Goodson, a friend of mine from college days, actually. She is a marriage and family therapist and addictions counselor in Winfield, Kansas, as well as a Lutheran deaconess. Start out with, what is your, we mentioned this briefly because we said that you were a Lutheran deaconess, and so there's obviously some Lutheranism in there now. But what is your faith background and how do you currently spiritually identify?
So I grew up Southern Baptist, and it was certainly everything that I did in my entire life was Southern Baptist. So that was a really big part of my life, though beginning in my teen years, it didn't fit great. And part of what was going on is I really didn't like the approach towards women. And I also had a hard time with feeling like my feelings didn't always matter in that environment. it wasn't acceptable to be angry about things. It wasn't
Mhm.
acceptable to feel sad. And as an anxious and sometimes depressed child and preteen adolescent, that felt really rejected. And I have a very vivid memory of sadly listening to the youth group song, if you're saved and you know it, clap your hands. And like, I remember crying in the bathroom to that song because it was just like, I can't do this anymore. I can't.
Mhm.
I don't feel happy, and I don't feel like clapping my hands. So where is that when I need it from God? And so I currently identify as Lutheran. Part of that change came about with really settling in with some Lutherans who helped me be able to see some. I really connected with the theology of the Lutheran Church, in addition to just it's the way that it dealt in reality in terms of emotions. It was a really beautiful experience for me, and I also wanted to baptize my children. It was kind of an interesting change for my husband and I. So when we had our kids, we wanted them baptized, and Lutherans do that. So
Mhm.
we went along.
You define forgiveness.
So I think that this is such an interesting topic, um, because it's not something that you would find. In kind of trying to collect my thoughts on this. Um, it's not something that we talk a lot about necessarily in our education formation as therapists.
Mhm.
So it's something that I know very much from my religious background, but maybe not a whole lot clinically.
Mhm.
Though it is definitely the case that I have so many clients um, who have this idea of forgiveness as something that's really central to what they want to be doing in therapy,
Mhm.
whether it's in a relationship that they want to repair, or they have been through something really traumatic and they want to be able to forgive the person who's harmed them. And so as I was kind of thinking through what are the things that I usually talk about with clients with forgiveness, the main thing that came up for me was this idea that it's a process and it's not a single act. It's not a one time I extend my forgiveness and that somehow magically unlocks um, feelings of joy and happiness for you, and it makes the relationship easier to be in. And everything that happened to you, it like reverses in time, and you're magically whole again. So it's a process, and then there's this other idea that it's kind of a. I think that it's more for the person who does it than it is necessarily for the person who's being forgiven. I think that it's a monument, it's an event that happens for that individual, and it has to do with letting go of wanting to see the other person suffer for what they've done. Um, yeah. So I think process, letting go of retaliation. Um, and then this other word kept coming up, this idea of exoneration, which is something that I talk about a lot with clients when we're doing some more classic family systems therapy work,
Mhm.
um, where we kind of look at who has been impactful for us in kind of these really intricate and complex ways that maybe um, had a negative impact on us in some way, but we work to understand and have some insight into what they were doing, as a way to kind of go, hey, you know what? Um, maybe maybe we can exonerate them. Maybe we don't say what they did was okay or I'm fine with it, but we say I have some insight into what was going on with what happened with them. And it's a way of kind of applying some mercy to your family tree.
Mhm. Mhm.
Um, I know it's a long list. My definition isn't really succinct. It's a list. It's a bullet point list. But
Yeah.
um, I think that another really important part for me is that it's not the same as reconciliation, which I'm sure we'll
Mhm.
get into in a little
Mhm.
bit.
Mhm.
It doesn't automatically mean that we go back to being the same way in the relationship, which I think
Mhm.
is really important, especially with couples. I deal with that a lot in couples work that, you know, even if he or she or they forgive you, it doesn't mean that the relationship automatically goes back to the way that it was.
Mhm.
And then finally, I use the metaphor of a rope when I talk about forgiveness quite a bit with my clients. This idea that sometimes the thing that we're holding on to um, so desperately is going to just leave us with rope burn or rope burn, because this idea of the difficult things that have happened to us did indeed happen. And when we um, practice radical acceptance, is an idea that I talk about with clients, this idea
Mhm.
that it's not okay the things that happen to us. However, continually holding on to them pulls at us in a way that's hazardous, that will tear our skin apart.
Mhm.
And so being able to actively and mindfully practice having a sense of acceptance around what happened in my past,
Mhm.
and it doesn't say anything about who I am. It has to do with my past.
Mhm.
So my relationship with the present moment is going to be better impacted and more effective if I can have the open hand towards
Mhm.
it rather than the clenched fist.
Mhm.
Uh, So those are my opening thoughts on forgiveness.
What are the limitations of forgiveness? I know that, yeah, I think it's really interesting, that you mentioned that it wasn't a part of your therapy um, formation, because like it's certainly in, I want to say in sort of popular ideas of what it means to popular ideas of like healing and sort of self healing and coping with things that have happened to you, certainly sort of centralize forgiveness as it's a narrative in a lot of sort of popular culture out there and popular sort of wisdom, as well as in stories, narratives that we have. What are the limitations of forgiveness that you find as a concept?
So many. I think, and I almost always, um, when a client comes to me and says that they want to forgive someone, I always know that the whatever road it is that we're going to have to walk to get there is going to be so much more difficult than the client realizes. So it's like one of those topics that when a client brings it up, I'm almost always like, okay. I'm remembering a specific case, way de-identified, but um, an older teenager who had a lot of difficult things going on in their life, and their guardian was really, really insistent that this teenager forgive,
Mhm.
forgive. Like, you need to forgive this person.
Mhm.
Um, and the teenager was like, I don't get why this is so important to her. I don't understand why she wants me to do this. It makes no sense. And even if like I can say that I forgive someone, but she doesn't know. Like
Mhm.
I could lie and say, yeah, I forgive this person. But I don't. And that was incredibly valid, that idea was really valid because the hurt was still there. And
Mhm.
the trauma itself was so egregious that of course it's going to be difficult to forgive. um, an adult would have a hard time forgiving this act, and there's no way that a teenager could possibly do that. um, so I think some of the limits are, sometimes people confuse forgiveness um, with justice. Justice is different, right? Like, so forgiveness is a merciful act, and I think if we there are values that are kind of in conflict there. So our scriptures do tell us, we do have a commandment to forgive, but we also have commandments about justice. We have notions of justice, and that is a value. And so trying to live into having some congruent thoughts around what needs to happen when something goes wrong in relationships means that sometimes we can't forgive until there has been justice in some way.
Yeah, yeah. Almost, I think a lot about, in my day job, I work at a center that works with survivors of torture from around the world. And I'm in a very sort of admin clerical data type role. But the whole culture of the organization is sort of steeped in trauma-informed practice. Everything from, obviously the clinical approach, but everything that we do, that's very central, and they make a very concerted effort to sort of imbue that into our culture as a center. And I'm always thinking about how we approach basically what a trauma-informed church, a trauma-informed congregation, and trauma-informed pastoral ministry would look like. Especially thinking about issues of justice and even issues of it's almost an issue of safety, right? That forgiveness is puts you in an incredibly vulnerable position if you are somebody who has been harmed by somebody more powerful than you.
Yes.
I think a lot about the stories that I hear from folks in the queer community about forgiveness being, almost weaponized in a way, that you need to, you've been deeply hurt or abused by family or faith communities, but you need to just forgive. And so I'm wondering about, I think originally when I'd sent you notes, I'd sent you the question about forgiveness being harmful or oppressive, but I want to sort of take that in sort of a different direction of how do churches talk about, this sort of core theological conviction of forgiveness in a trauma-informed way?
Yeah. I like the way that you state that with having a trauma-informed approach as a church. I do think, I think this gets a little bit to one of the another limitation of forgiveness, which is, it can have, if we are too too narrowly focused on forgiveness, it also becomes this act of self invalidation, where we're telling ourselves we can't feel angry about what's happened. We can't feel, name the emotion. We can't feel it because we've already forgiven the person, or the system or the institution, whatever. And I think that is one of the foremost things that you want to do in a trauma-informed approach is you want to validate someone's feelings around what happened. And if you are forcing someone to forgive, then it really is telling them whatever it is that you are feeling, you need to be able to turn that off somehow. And it gives kind of this false notion of like the idea that forgiveness is the magic button that you can just push it and your feelings about all of it will change. And it doesn't. It doesn't at all. And I think that's something that people often come to me and expect to happen. I've made this decision. They'll often say, I forgave them, so I don't understand why I still have all of this guilt about what happened, why I still have all of this anger for this person. Well, because they hurt you. And, forgiveness doesn't erase the fact that you still have to go through a grief process because of that pain.
So I guess to finish up, a real fast half hour. do you approach forgiveness in your own life, and how do you talk about it as a parent with your kids?
Yeah. Um, I think that probably in my own life, what has been most difficult is those kinds of issues where, it has been it's been people in the church who have hurt me, or just kind of like really abstract, like the church has hurt, or um, people in the institution. Um, and I know that part of that forgiveness process for me has been trying to um, see them as human, and to see them as, they aren't Satan. They're, for the most part, right? And trying to accept that we know of. And so just trying to accept, like, if they had, eh, that the things that were done that were wrong, maybe I can look at it from a more validating their point of view perspective.
Mhm.
And to be clear, I'm not talking about any, this is not physical, sexual abuse. This is the things that you can look at and go, well, there was some kind of, there was a person here doing this, right? So I think it's a lot more complex. And in my own life, I focus on having a sense of compassion towards people who have hurt me, which is really, really hard. The only note that you sent me this question ahead of time, and the only note that I have underneath it is, wow, that's really hard. Um, because it's just incredibly, incredibly difficult.
Yeah.
With my children, I think I emphasize with them, you need to work to have have relationships that are healthy and that are good for you. And if you are in a situation where someone is repeatedly hurting you, um, you can forgive them. And you also need to make sure that you're setting firm boundaries with them about, this is not okay to treat me this way. Because I think I see overall, I have two daughters, and I think our culture does a really poor job of helping women be able to understand, you can forgive someone, and it doesn't mean that you get to go right back into the relationship and have all of the privileges of the relationship back intact. And so I work with so many domestic violence situations, children who are in those situations, and women. And it's just incredibly difficult um, to hear these victims of domestic violence say, well, my church is just really encouraging me to just forgive him, and we should just get back together, and we're married after all, and we have children together. And so I think a trauma-informed church would certainly be looking at that process far differently.
Friends, the promise of God is that out of our desperation, out of our hurt, out of the worst possible things that can happen to us, God calls us and empowers us to continue to be a blessing to others. Hold on to that promise as you go through this week. Thank you.